It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Ray Comfort, and we're going to be discussing his book, Word on the Street: How to Share the Gospel in the Open Air. Ray, it is always a joy to speak with you. Welcome back to the show.
Great. So you're another guy that's attracted to shiny objects. I'm a squirrel. When I see another squirrel, I just run after them like my dog.
Oh yeah. I've been attracted to shiny objects ever since I was a toddler, and apparently that fascination has not ended. Now that I'm not chasing shiny objects in the yards, I go after books and authors that strike my fancy. And this is, I think, your third time on the show, so you must be a shiny enough object that I keep coming back to you.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Well, Ray, I think I'd love to start today by having you share a little bit about your journey into open air preaching. I know for a lot of people in my generation, we grew up seeing you doing open air preaching. So we've seen pictures of you doing it in video, you have training material. So I'm kind of curious, once you were out of the cradle walking around, did you just start open air preaching, or is this something that you came upon later in life?
No, I found everlasting life, and I'm kind of excited about that. I'm like a doctor who's got a cure to cancer, and he's on steroids wanting to get it out. So my whole thought was, and I've just got to give you a little bit of background because I may look like a bold sort of person, but I'm not. I'm reasonably shy. A lot of people would disagree, but I am. I know my own heart. But when I was in high school, I was asked to make a speech in front of my class, and I dried up. It was on my favorite subject, surfing. I talked about it all the time, but I dried up. My mind went blank, and I humiliated myself in front of my peers at the age of about 16, which was horrific. And I remember thinking to myself, I will never, ever speak in public again. And then I became a Christian about 8 years later. Yeah, 6 years later, who cares? And the first thing I knew I had to do was to shout this message of everlasting life from the housetop. So I remember once I was in a bus and I was sitting there thinking, man, all these people are sitting in the shadow of death. I've found everlasting life. I would love to stand up and share the gospel with them. And I thought the bus driver would stop the bus for sure and then in unison throw me off the bus. So I prayed a very dangerous prayer. I just said this: oh God, I wish there was somewhere where I could open air preach. It was just a kind of thought. And 2 weeks later, our city of 350,000 people, the city of Christchurch down under in New Zealand, legalized public speaking. And I just thought to myself, wow, what an answer to prayer. Horrors. And I didn't even take any notice of the local square or reading news for about 2 weeks. And then I saw a picture of a little old lady. She's in her 70s, I think. She was called the Bible Lady, and it had a picture of her with a violin. It said, the Bible Lady in the square, speaker's corner, sharing her Christian faith. And I felt ashamed. And so I went in and I just prayed for courage. And to tell you I was scared it's just not true. Scared, horror, mortification. I was about 6 feet above that. But I did. I spoke to about 40 or 50 people, shared the gospel, and then I went back over 3,000 times, almost every day, when it wasn't raining. If it rained, I'd go on and want to preach about Noah, but no one would listen. So I didn't. But my fears are still there, but I've been able to control them. But here is why, if I may say so. Do you want to say anything?
No, you're doing great.
Okay.
I will interrupt you with other questions, but keep
Yeah,
going.
please do. Um, so why open air preach? And this is my philosophy. If I was in a lifeboat and I was pulling in people one by one, I would think how wonderful that I'm being used to save a life. But if I got a rope and pulled in 20 people at once, how much better is that? And that's what open air preaching is. Open air preaching is 1 to 100 people. And so it's far better to open air preach than it is 1 although I still do 1 all the time. Jesus open air preached, John the Baptist open air preached. The Bible says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And that's one way to reach many with this wonderful gospel that we have. In fact, a good open air preacher in a good open air session can reach more people in 30 minutes than the average church does in 30 years.
And in terms of obviously, you've trained and encouraged people to do witnessing and open air preaching through the years. Which do you find scares people more? Is it that one-on-one witnessing or the getting up on a soapbox, so to speak, and open air preaching? Which one is more horrifying to people?
Getting up on a soapbox is far worse because you can say to the person that you're one-to-oneing on, just say, I got to go. And you just leave and it's all over. But if you stand up on a box, you're making a spectacle of yourself. Now, I've got a friend, his name is Chad Williams. He's an author. He was a Navy SEAL, SEAL 7. And one day I saw him standing in the crowd. I said, Chad, come and share the gospel. And he jumped up on the box and he told me afterwards, he wasn't as scared skydiving for the first time than he was when he stood up to preach. And he's a courageous guy. So it's very, very spiritual. The enemy doesn't want anyone lifting up their voice like a trumpet to show this people their transgressions. And so it does take a lot of courage, but it's the sort of courage that a firefighter has when he climbs a ladder to rescue a mother and two children from a burning building. He's not thinking of himself. He's thinking of that mother. He's not thinking of his own fears and his own pleasures. He's thinking of the fate of that mother and her two children as the flames lick them. And the Bible says, others having compassion, making a difference, pulling them from the fire, hitting them in the garment spotted by the flesh. So I'm always challenged as to how deep my love is. Is it deep enough to stand on a box in a university and preach the gospel to every creature as we've been told to do?
And what I really appreciate about this book is it's kind of a turnkey, step by step walkthrough of how to get ready and how to execute and really how to successfully step out and do some open air preaching. But in terms of that preparation before we drag the soapbox out into the square, how do we prepare our heart and mind and kind of get our inner world ready before we start open air preaching?
Well, it's summed up with one word, help. That's
That
what I'm
classic prayer, help.
help. Yeah. Oh God, if you don't speak through me, it'll be dead letter. I pray in my car when I'm going somewhere like that. And I realize that I'm going somewhere I don't want to go to say something I don't want to say to people who don't want to hear it. But I go because I love people. And Christians are kind of like police officers, upholders of the law among criminals. They're not going to be actually very popular with the criminals. If they open their mouth and say anything, especially talk about crime and punishment, we're not going to be too popular with the world because of their guilt. Jesus said, the world hates me because I speak of its deeds that they're evil. And so there is that knowledge, but there is a way to do it, to be gentle and loving and kind without compromise, um, because the love of Christ dwells within us. And those who are genuinely born again have access to that love that we can manifest in our preaching, the way we talk to people.
And in terms of what our actual message is, what we share, are there certain high points of the gospel message or things that you would say we should work into every single message that we share? Like, what are some boundaries? I mean, have do you always know what you want to share ahead of time, or does it sometimes come to you on the spot? Tell us a little bit about good protocol for preparing a message.
Well, there are certain things we should talk about. For instance, when a doctor talks to a patient who's dying of a disease and he has the cure in his pocket, he shouldn't forget about the cure. And we should never forget about the cure when we're talking to dying sinners, people who are under the shadow of death. We should always remember that God provided forgiveness of sins and the gift of everlasting life through the cross. And so that cross is the focal point. Paul said, I preach Christ and Him crucified. I know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. So I'm always heading in that direction, but I take different springboards there because there's certain ways to get people's attention. One is through the Socratic method, where we ask questions. Do you think there's a heaven? Do you think God exists? Do you think you're a sinner? Are you a good person? Asking questions is good because you're not pointing the finger. You're asking for them to share their thoughts. And so it's very, very important to begin in the natural, as Jesus did with a woman at the well. He didn't talk to her about her adultery straight away. He talked to her about water and thirst and then swung to the spiritual. And we do the same with the gospel, whether it be one-to-one or open-air preaching. It's good to start in the natural because the natural man receives not the things of the Spirit of God, neither can he know them, they're foolishness to him because they're spiritually understood. So when you're going to turn a light on for someone who's in darkness, it's best not to try a flashlight in their eyes. That's going to offend them. You use a light dimmer. And so the servant of the Lord must be gentle unto all men. Turn the light on gently, and we can do it if we look at what Jesus did and what the apostles did.
And this is probably too fancy of a word. How do we choose our venue, so to speak, for open air preaching? And any tips and tricks for picking a good place? Maybe give us an example of what would be a good place and maybe a not so good place to open air preach.
Yeah, a motorbike convention is not a good place. I have been tempted to go to, was it Sturgis? Is that the one?
Yep, in South Dakota. Yep.
Yeah, I thought, oh, I'd love to go and preach to the bikers. And I thought, hang on, just one of those motorbikes on and you're drowned out. Like they've got 10,000 or pum, pum, pum. So for certain places that it's not good, don't be by a highway or a freeway or a roadway where there's going to be horns honking and cars accelerating. Don't be by a fountain. At the first, when you start, you'll say, oh, there's a little trickle beside me. And after about 10 minutes, it'll sound like a waterfall, like Niagara Falls, because um, you get a little tired in your preaching, and so the ambience tends to be louder after you get going for a while. So choose a venue where your voice will be trapped, if you can. You can preach towards the ocean and your voice gets lost, but if you preach towards a cliff or a building, you'll hear it echo back. So it's good to use wisdom and things like that. And also wind direction. You don't want to preach into a hurricane. You'll get the message back in your face. You preach with a hurricane behind you blowing it, or just a light wind behind you. Always look at a flag or smoke, which way it's going, and go so that your voice goes downhill along with the wind. And as I said before, things like this don't seem to matter at first, but if you get a good crowd and you're preaching for an hour or 2 hours, those things can be very, very beneficial in your preaching. I went to UCLA once and we gave out, I think, our 180 video in universities across the country. My job was to be there and give out 180s in UCLA, and I just jumped up on a wall and started preaching. Not condemning people, but just saying, anyone here, any thoughts on the afterlife sort of thing? And people came around, and I had a crowd of between 300 and 400 people for 2 hours. They would not go away. Not that I was popular, but that I had hecklers, and it was interesting. I mean, you've got any movie from the past that's of the era, a sword fight is always interesting, and it's not just clank, clank, clank. It's just all over the place, cartwheels and swinging down, and so when there's a sword fight verbally between a preacher and a heckler, that's fascinating. And that plays in well with the gospel. People stay and hear the gospel. Jesus had hecklers all over the place. So did the Apostle Paul. Some of the most wonderful truths we have in Scripture is because someone yelled out something to Jesus and he answered them.
And I wasn't going to ask this till a few questions later, but since you mentioned hecklers, I'll go there now. Um, are they sometimes a help and yet sometimes a hindrance? Like in terms of heckler management, how can you use them to your benefit and not your detriment?
Yeah, there's a certain heckler that's really good. He'll speak up and he'll shut up when you want him to. But there are certain hecklers that speak up and don't shut up. They're there to not learn or um, ask questions. They're there to drown you out. And I've had people stand by my soapbox and play a guitar incessantly, not even playing chords, just to drown me out. So we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So it's very important to recognize when you've got a good heckler. And I certainly can. I can see a good heckler from a mile away. Just the way he dresses and how he responds when I go up and say, hey, can you come over and I speak to you? And they are wonderful. My favorite heckler of all time was a man called the Wizard. And him and I crossed swords in Christchurch and Speaker's Corner for 12 years. He was on second lunch hour. I was on first. And if he ever showed up in my crowd, my heart leapt for joy because he'd stand there listening for a few moments and then he'd step forward, bend himself back, put his hand in the air like a regally, and then he'd yell out, Ray, comfort you, Bible bashing Baptist. I'm not even a Baptist, I don't think, but it fitted good in his narrative. And just the way he spoke would bring in a crowd and he'd stop and let me speak. He wasn't a Christian. Sometimes he'd let me on his ladder to preach to his crowd. Sometimes he'd go berserk at me and people would feel sorry for me, but I didn't feel sorry for myself because I knew after this we'd go off for a cup of tea because we were friends. He even came home for a meal once. And so it's good to befriend hecklers. And my thought was if Jesus could call Judas friend as he betrayed him, we can make friends of sinners. And I do that regularly with hecklers.
And in terms of drawing a crowd, like what are some of the creative ways we can bring in a group of people to listen to us?
Well, that's a good question because I had trouble drawing it. Is this Ken Ham? Yes, it is. I'll just have to delete him. Uh, yeah, for years I got on my box and I would have a crowd of maybe 20, 24 people sitting in front of me. They were just regulars that sat and ate lunch. And I wanted to draw a lot of people that hadn't heard the gospel. So I'd show up with a very gripping anecdote, something that would grab their attention. And that always made me nervous because if you fluff it, it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't make sense. So I'd get up there, I'd practice my anecdote, and then I'd just share it, and then it might get a heckler. I'd bounce off into the gospel. But about 30 years ago, I started asking trivia. I'd stand up on a box and say, "Hey, anyone here know the capital of France?" Someone would say, "Paris." And I'd say, "Oh, you must be a university student or something." "That's correct. Here, here's $1." And I'd give them $1 as a gift. And then I'd say, "What's the opposite of up? Anybody know?" And someone would say, "Down." I'd say, "Hey, very good. Here's yours." And I'd say, "Tommy, what's your name?" I was just a little kid. "What's your name?" He'd say, "Tommy." I'd say, "Oh, here's $1 for you. You got it right." And that creates goodwill within the crowd. We've got a book on trivia, good trivia questions to ask people. So we just open that, give away $1 bills, maybe 10 or 12 $1 bills. And then you just say when a crowd gathers, because it's fun, anyone here like to go for $5? If you prove to be a good person, I'll give you $5. If you're not, I'll still give you $5. Just get up on the box and let's go for it. Some guy will get up and say, "Yeah, I'm a good person." Okay. Can I ask questions from the 10 Commandments? Remember, $5 whether you're good or not. So let's go. And I say, "How many lies you told? Ever stolen something?" And it's just worked out really, really good because the guy gets the money, he's happy, the crowd's happy that a preacher's giving away money, something that hardly ever happens, and it creates goodwill, and it's a great springboard for the gospel. And my contention is, Jesus said you'll either love money or you'll love God. So the way to get the attention of the world is give away money.
That's a good tip. I love the preachers giving away money. How that feels like such a weird spectacle because we're often asking for money, not
It's like
not
water
giving it away.
running uphill.
Yeah, just don't know what to do. They can't unsee it.
Yes.
What about we've talked about hecklers, but if you encounter people from other faiths, other religions, so I suppose that could be another kind of a heckler. So if you encountered a Jehovah's Witness, a Muslim, even a Catholic, a false convert, like how do you deal with people of other faiths kind of attacking you specifically with like theological points or ideas?
Yeah, you don't panic. Um, just say, "Okay, so you're a Mormon. Could you tell me how I can make it to the kingdom?" You use their language and say, "I've got a knife on my back. I've got 3 minutes to live. Please tell me how to enter the kingdom." That sends a Jehovah's Witness into outer space. He just doesn't know how to handle that because their religion is based on works righteousness. And they'll say something, "Well, you've got to gain knowledge to enter the kingdom. You've got to go door to door and share the message of the kingdom." I say, "Look, I got 1.5 minutes to live now. Are you going to tell me or not? How can I enter the kingdom? I'm terrified. I've broken the commandments." And when they say, "No, I can't do anything for you," just say, "Well, what about the thief on the cross? He turned to Jesus. He acknowledged his sins. He was a thief. He said, 'Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' And he was saved by the grace of God. And then he began his wonderful plan where the Romans came and broke his legs. That's the wonderful plan of being a Christian. It's not a bed of roses, it's a stack of thorns. If it's a Muslim, you just say to the Muslim, "Could you tell me how I can enter heaven? How can I avoid hell?" And a Muslim doesn't know if he's going to heaven or going to hell. All he can do is do his best. And so you treat everyone the same. You just begin differently. And with a Jehovah's Witness or a Muslim, you take them through the commandments to bring the knowledge of sin and show how the gap they're trying to jump is wider than the widest part of the Grand Canyon. You cannot uh, earn your way to heaven by facing Mecca and fasting and praying and repenting because God's a judge. You cannot go door to door enough times and merit to enter heaven or enter the kingdom by being Jehovah's Witness. It's all by grace through faith, and God can extend mercy through the cross. So it's successful to preach the cross, not just to a Jehovah's Witness or a Muslim that's on the box, but to the 100 or 200 people that have gathered to see something like a bit of a sword fight. So it becomes not just a one, it's not just him you're speaking at, but not only him, but the crowd. And if it's being filmed, then it goes on YouTube and can get 1 million views, a really good thing like that.
Well, people certainly do like taking videos of anything and everything today. Who knows where that video of you open air preaching could end up? Let's talk a bit about Charles Spurgeon. You referenced Spurgeon a number of times throughout the book. What can the Prince of Preachers teach us about open air, or I think as he would have called it, street preaching?
Yeah, he just blew me away, and through a book called Lectures to My Students. There's a couple of chapters there on open air preaching, and I've got to tell you, my wife lost a lot of sleep because of Spurgeon. I would be reading, she'd be snoozing, and I go, wait, wait, wake up, listen to this. Because Spurgeon said things about open air preaching that he could only have known if he open air preached. I think he couldn't know that by being a silent. He doesn't. How did he know that? And so it's called Lectures to My Students, the most marvelous book. And I love Spurgeon. I like to say Spurgeon was quotable even if he talked in his sleep. You know, you can open any of his sermons and just go and read it, and you go, oh, Spurgeon makes me never want to preach ever again because he's so good and brilliant in everything. I think to myself, wow, what a revelation. God just gave me a wonderful revelation. I bet nobody's ever heard this before. Look it up, type in Spurgeon, and he's done it. He's been there, he's preached it, and I can't wait to meet the guy. And I'm wondering what his voice sounded like. I wrote a book on Spurgeon and found a quote about his voice. And all the guy said that heard him speak is he said he sounded like silver. He couldn't explain it in any way. It was just such a unique, amazing voice.
Sounds like a voice that had a special anointing on it. That would be how I might try to
Yeah, we'll probably
process
meet
that.
him. He's got a little squeaky voice, and God used him anyway.
God did all the rest. This kind of a conversation, I know it's going to attract viewers and listeners who have an inkling towards open air preaching, or they're thinking about it, or maybe God is convicting them, and they've gotten to this point of the conversation, but they're still a little bit nervous. So, what would be your encouragement to take the plunge and get out there and do it if that's where God's pushing you, leading you?
Well, you're always going to be nervous. If you want to see a wimp, watch me in a swimming pool that's not heated, waiting to jump in. I am just pathetic. It's like, and I just have to just grab hold of myself. Come on, I'm a man. I'm not a mouse. I'm going to jump in. And so I jump in, and for 5 to 10 seconds, my flesh feels it. And then I come up, and then I'm fine. It adjusts. And exactly the same with open air preaching. You're going to just be so hesitant. You're going to be nervous. Fear is going to grip your heart. And your flesh is going to hurt just when you get up to open your mouth. But as soon as you speak, you think, what am I afraid of? Especially if you ask, begin with a trivia thing. Anyone can ask trivia. What's the capital of Germany? Anybody know? Here's $1 for you. What's the capital of England? Yeah, that's not hard. And then you just say, who wants to go for $5? Going to take you through the 10 Commandments, if that's okay. And so it dissipates your fears. But the key is to have love. And I may have used this analogy before. If you're going to, if I said to you, will you jump into a pond that's 4 feet deep, that's got big chunks of ice in it, so cold it will kill you in 3 minutes? Can I ever get you to jump in? You say, never. So what's that 4-year-old boy fell in and his feet didn't touch the bottom and he was drowning? What would you do? Just stand there? Say, no, I'd jump in a second and grab him. You wouldn't care about your flesh. You wouldn't care about the cold because love does that. And the waters of personal evangelism, and especially open air preaching, are freezing. They're ice cold. You won't want to jump in, but you do it because of love. So if you've got problems with fear when it comes to reaching the lost, don't pray for less fear. Pray for more love, because that's the problem.
And in terms of resources, obviously at Living Waters, you guys have tons of tracks and resources that can help in connecting with somebody one to one, or even connecting with a larger crowd. What are some of your favorite resources when you're out there open air preaching?
Oh, the trivia book on trivia, the $1 million bills and the giant money. You can give those away instead of real money, and people still love them. But I would like to qualify, if I may, don't yell at people. There are certain street preachers that stand on corners and it doesn't seem that they care about people. They just care about yelling at them as they're going past. Like, I'm doing this and you just deal with it. People need to hear love in your tone and concern. It's good to tell sinners you love them. I'm speaking to you today because I love you. I'd rather be with my wife. She's nicer looking than you are. but I'm here because I love you and I care about you. And then you give away the money because you love them, or you give them a book afterwards. You may like to read this, and thank you for talking to me. Serve the Lord, must not strive, but be gentle unto all men, and meekness instructing those that oppose themselves. So we have a stereotype of the street preacher that's standing on the corner with a bullhorn or a sign saying, you're going to hell. That's not what we're talking about when it comes to open air preaching. And you can see our open air preaching on our YouTube channel. There's quite a few of them. We've just passed 161 million views on our YouTube channel, which is just so exciting. So you can see how it's done and see how you need not fear hecklers. Um, Seeing them again and again will help to dissipate your fears through our YouTube channel.
And just like it happens in a one-on-one situation when we're talking to somebody, or if it's a one-to-many where we're speaking to a crowd, people can feel whether or not we have an attitude of love towards them, just like it is in a room with one other person or to a large crowd. As we're talking, they can sense where our heart is most of the time. So yeah, definitely want to have an attitude of love. And Ray, in terms of people connecting with your ministry, finding out more about you, your resources, where do we discover you on the web?
Well, just come around to our house and you can have a look around. No, livingwaters.com. You can just see everything. You can get free stuff, a lot of free stuff. We're actually giving away 250,000 books coming up in May. We're throwing them up people's driveways. It's all paid for. 250,000 books on Bible prophecy. You can learn about things like that by signing up for our free email newsletter.
Well, like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Ray and pick up your very own copy of the book we talked about today. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Ray Comfort. Once again, our book today was Word on the Street: How to Share the Gospel in the Open Air. For more on Ray, his books, his ministry, you can head on over to their website. Once again, you can find that at livingwaters.com. And Ray, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's always a pleasure. It's always an honor to have you on the show.
It was mutual. Thanks for having me.